Hi everyone, my name is Max and this all happened in 2002, a year I thought would be pretty normal. I'm a cop in a quiet little town in Maine. I was 27 years old at the time and my life was nothing to write home about. It never has been, and I'm very happy about that. I generally spent my days solving minor fights, patrolling the same streets and drinking coffee in the little coffee shop across the street from the police station, where everyone knows who I am. I married young, and by that time I had 5 years with my wife Irma and 2 children, Leo and Ava, who are the most important things to me. My town is not exactly a place full of surprises, and neither was it then. It's more of a place where people go about their business, and everything was calm until things suddenly started to go awry. At first I got a tip about someone missing, something that was generally not uncommon. This place is surrounded by forest and sometimes people get lost. But what I got was a call from Mrs. Perkins, who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Her son Christopher, a guy who worked in construction, hadn't been back for 2 days and she was very worried. Christopher was well known for going on a bender often, but he always came home drunk but fine. "Max, can you get Chris for me?" asked Mrs. Perkins, her voice sounding desperate indeed. "Sure, I'll take a walk around his usual places, and when I find him, I'll bring him to you myself. Don't worry," I replied, grabbing my keys and heading out. As soon as I got out of there, I set out to look for Mrs. Perkins's son. I went through all his usual places, the bar downtown, the construction site, and even the motel where he used to stay sometimes, but nothing at all. No sign of Chris. His co-workers hadn't seen him either, which was rather odd. However, they told me that he had been acting strange lately, that he was a bit paranoid that someone was watching him. It was probably just the effect of the drinks, I thought, but I decided to investigate further. Unfortunately, that day I had to return to Mrs. Perkins' house without her son and without answers. The days passed, and soon it was a week without news from Christopher. His mother was getting more and more nervous and desperate, and so was I. It was just too weird for someone to disappear without a trace. It was just too rare for someone to just disappear in town. One night, I got a call from Edward, my partner on the force. "Max, you need to see this," he said in a serious tone. "Come over to Freddy's farm and meet me there." Freddy's farm was an old farmhouse that was abandoned on the outskirts of town and was a place where the guys always dared each other to go. It was Halloween when I decided to drive up there to see what my buddy wanted to show me. With the headlights illuminating the darkness, I could see Edward waiting outside, leaning against his car door. "What's going on?" I asked him as he got out of the car. "You have to see for yourself," he said, leading me inside the building. As soon as I crossed the threshold of the rickety old door, my sense of smell was met with an odd, musty aroma, with a hint of something metallic that immediately made my skin crawl. Then Edward shone his flashlight on the floor, and there I saw it. A dark stain, big and scary, soaking into the wood. "My God," I muttered, feeling my heart begin to pound. "Who the hell is it?" I asked my partner. "I have no idea," he replied, "but it must be recent, no more than a day old." This disturbing finding immediately put us on alert. We searched the place from top to bottom, but found nothing else. No bodies, no clues, no traces of violence. Nothing. Just that huge pool of blood. Since we couldn't find anything on our own, we called in reinforcements from the county, and before I knew it, the place was swarming with forensics. But they didn't find much either. It looked like someone had done their best to clean up the scene, but for some reason, they didn't bother to get rid of the blood that was left there. As the days passed, more people began to disappear. First it was Clara, the waitress at the coffee shop, then old Angus, who who lived alone in his house just a few blocks away from Clara. Each case became stranger and stranger, always with no signs of a struggle and no witnesses. They had simply vanished. The town was nervous, and of course my wife was also very scared. I tried to calm her down, but the truth was that I was scared too, especially for our little ones. One night while on patrol, I got a call from her. "Max, you have to come, there's someone outside," she whispered. Her voice was shaky and barely audible. "I see a shadow near the barn, and I have no idea who it might be," she told me. "Stay inside, lock the doors, and go to the room with the kids. I'll be there in 5 minutes," I told her, my heart pounding as I ran home. When I arrived, I found the children huddled with their mother, pale and scared. I told them everything would be all right and grabbed my flashlight, heading for the barn with the gun at the ready. The moon was bright, casting chilling shadows in the yard. As I approached, I heard a creak and a faint rustle. Then I opened the door and directed the light into the gloom. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound firm despite the fear that consumed me. I was silent for a moment, but then a figure appeared. It was a dirty, gaunt, wild-eyed fellow. He was in the bones, dressed in torn and blood-stained clothes. "Christopher?" I asked, almost without recognizing him. "Help me. He's coming," he murmured in a raspy voice. "Who's coming?" I inquired, carefully approaching. But before I could answer, he collapsed on the floor. I immediately called an ambulance, and when Chris arrived at the hospital, he was a mess. His condition was critical, but at least he was alive, and as soon as he came to, he started telling a chilling story. Christopher said he had been kidnapped by a guy he called the Collector. This man, he would take people and hold them captive in a sort of bunker buried somewhere deep in the woods, feeding them just enough to survive until he decided to harvest them, as he said, according to Chris. Fortunately, he managed to escape in time. When I told all this to the county sheriff, a search was immediately organized. My companions and I spent days exploring the forest, but found nothing. The disappearances continued and the panic in town was increasing. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, knowing that there was someone lurking, and as it was, he seemed to always be one step ahead of us. One night, I was at home trying to relax with Irma and the boys, when suddenly the power went out. The sudden darkness was disconcerting, but I quickly started looking for my flashlight. Suddenly the phone rang, and my heart started pounding. "Max, it's Edward. You need to come to the station, now," he said, the urgency in his voice palpable. I grabbed the keys as soon as I hung up and told Irma to stay put, secure everything, and not to leave the house under any circumstances. Then I drove to the station in a hurry. When I arrived, I met Edward with an expression on his face that I would never forget. "We got him," he said. "Who, the Collector?" I asked, almost in disbelief. "Yes, at the old quarry. You're not going to believe it, Max." We headed there right away. It was a long abandoned and overgrown place, but in the middle of a hidden clearing we found a makeshift bunker, just as Christopher had described. But despite what we already knew, no one prepared us for what we would find in there. When we managed to descend into the bunker, we found all the missing people from the town, some alive, some not. The sight was horrifying, macabre and grotesque. It was so shocking, I found it hard to stand. The people there were in the bones, almost unrecognizable. There were remains of food and feces everywhere, but definitely the most chilling was that the half-decomposed bodies of those who were no longer with us were scattered in several places, but several of them had been opened and their bones removed. That was the most horrible and macabre thing I had ever seen in my life. and it remains so to this day. The collector himself was there. He was a middle-aged guy with an expressionless face and an eerie calmness. He offered no resistance to the arrest, nor did he utter a word, just smiled with a cold, vacant grimace as we put him in handcuffs and transported him to the police station. The next few weeks became a whirlwind, with reporters everywhere and endless questions. Fortunately, all the people who were rescued alive managed to recover, while the bodies of the deceased were cremated and the ashes delivered to their relatives, this under the approval of themselves. Since after the discovery, we decided to talk to our neighbors and explain to them without being too explicit, of course, of the conditions in which the bodies of their loved ones were found, and we warned them that for sure they would not want to keep that last image of them, so everyone agreed that the best thing would be the cremation. The town tried to assimilate as best it could what had happened. Everyone was in mourning and shock, but as time went on, it gradually felt like something resembling normalcy. Although the road for Chris and the other survivors was going to be a little longer and more difficult. The collector, whose real name I prefer to keep anonymous, kidnapped these people and starved them to make them very thin, then murdered them, opened their bodies and extracted their bones, which he collected in the basement of his house, which was quite far from the village and very close to the forest. This man lived in the village, but practically never left his house, so no one knew him. The collector was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of leaving. The horror he caused in our town will never be forgotten, but at least I was reassured to know that he would never hurt anyone again. My name is James, and I'm a practicing police officer, but right now I'm enjoying a break because what I experienced a few weeks ago was so terrifying, the department simply decided to grant me a little time off to recuperate. But honestly, I still find it hard to believe how I haven't resigned. I was always a person who was afraid of the dark, but it wasn't a normal fear. It was a phobia that was with me since childhood. Nyctophobia, it's called. Yes, I know that sounds weird for a police officer, but I really wanted to get better, face my demons, and help people. No one was going to tell me I couldn't do my job, and I wouldn't let my stupid phobia rule me, although at first I still felt a little fear. However, with training and some therapy, I gradually gained more confidence and finally managed to become the officer I always wanted to be. However, there was one day when my badge, my training, and all my courage completely fell apart, without me being able to do anything about it. And the worst thing is that it happened in the least expected place. It was a normal day at the police station. We had already arrested a strange guy who was trying to assault a girl, when suddenly we got a call from a terrified victim. The girl was saying that we should go soon, that her boyfriend was a psychopath, a real bloodthirsty monster. We immediately went to the place, and when we arrived, there they were, the girl, visibly frightened, and the alleged criminal. The guy was about 2 meters tall, really tall, and looked at us with a blank expression. At first glance, he didn't look like a threat, but after seeing how nervous the girl looked, we knew there was something serious there. She was unharmed, but her face reflected a fear that I will never forget. She was paralyzed, just staring at him with wild eyes, as if she had seen the devil himself. Preemptively, we stopped the guy and took him to the station. I must be honest, this was the calmest transfer we ever had. The guy didn't put up any resistance and didn't make any attempt to escape or anything. He was as obedient as a puppy, but that gave my partner and I a bad feeling. We just wanted to get rid of him fast. When we got to the police station, I was tasked with putting him in one of the temporary cells. I figured he would stay there for about 24 hours, unless the girl decided there was something more complicated going on and pressed charges. But to be honest, I didn't think that was likely to happen. She just wanted us to keep him away from her person. When we arrived at the station, it was up to me to take him to the cell. But while I was doing so, one of the worst things that could happen to me happened. It just started to rain, and because of a lightning strike, the lights in the whole station went out. This obviously threw me completely off balance. I tried to find my emergency flashlight in my pants pocket, but my hands were shaking and panic was starting to take over. It was then that in the midst of my shock, I felt a very hard blow to the back of my head, and I fell to the ground. I started to look around trying to make out something in the gloom, but the only thing I could detect was that the guy I was carrying was gone. I could hear his footsteps running in the darkness, but they were not heading towards the office. I thought about running out to warn my colleagues, but I didn't want to risk alerting anyone, since the reason the guy had run away was because he was distracted and a cop can't afford such mistakes. I had to solve this without anyone finding out. So, in the middle of the darkness, I pulled out my gun and followed him back to the office. But that day, it was definitely not my lucky day. At that time, the offices were under renovation, so they were empty. Now I was in that dark room, on the verge of a panic attack because of my stupid phobia, and stuck with a very strange guy, someone who had scared a girl in such a way that she didn't even dare to report him. All she wanted was for that crazy guy to stay out of her life, and I couldn't let myself be scared. I was the officer of the law, the guy who was trained to deal with difficult situations and who carried a gun. I was definitely not the one who was going to run away. Plus, he was handcuffed. So I kept searching with my gun at the ready, while listening to the other officers gathering at the entrance or trying to find out if there was a light outside. Gradually, I began to feel the loneliness around me, because no one would have any reason to stay in the dark or to look for the escapee. Suddenly, I began to hear footsteps approaching. They were slow, but what made me most uneasy was their steadiness. They definitely didn't sound like the footsteps of someone trying to flee or hide. At that moment, something clicked in my head. I understood that this guy hadn't gone in there to hide from me, but to catch me. I was the prey here, and it was me who should be afraid, not him. Suddenly, the footsteps quickened. The man was coming straight at me, zigzagging, but I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't decipher where he was approaching from, so I started looking in all directions without managing to see anything. That's when I heard a warning, but before I could react, the guy ran violently towards me and embraced me with his cuffed hands, squeezing me with brutal force. I couldn't believe the enormous force this guy was exerting with his arms. It left me completely neutralized. It was like having a huge 2-meter python wrapping around me. Obviously, I struggled with him trying to get out of his grip, but it was inutile. And what was worse, in the middle of the struggle, my gun fell to the ground, and in a quick movement, he now surrounded my neck from behind and began to strangle me. I tried to resist and repel him in 1,000 ways, but it was useless. He seemed to know what he was doing, as if he had trained in martial arts or something, because his technique was relentless. Little by little, I felt I was losing my strength and fainting, but then, in an absolutely terrifying outburst, he let out a deafening scream in my ear that left me stunned. At that moment, I lost all my strength and felt my consciousness fade away. But just at that instant, the door burst open and a bunch of flashlights shone on the guy, but he didn't seem to give up. At that moment, his grip loosened for an instant, and that allowed me to get some air. My buddies ordered him to let go of me, but he wouldn't do it. They were about to shoot him, but out of nowhere the light came back. At that moment, the man looked up and, as if he had transformed, he adopted a calmer posture and let me go, just like that, as if nothing had happened. I fell to the ground, crying and gasping, while the other officers arrested him again and led him to a dungeon. Finally, the nightmare was over. The man was arrested for assaulting an officer, and right after the fact, I began my forced vacation. During the time at home, I learned that he was receiving frequent visits from a woman who seemed to treat him with unusual enthusiasm, and it turned out that this woman was the same one who had reported him. We were shocked to discover that she actually had no connection to him, and soon learned that she was writing a book about his story. There were things I couldn't figure out, like the power outage or why the man calmed down when he saw the flashlights, but part of me couldn't help but think that this was all planned, and that this woman might not be the victim we all thought she was. I'm a guy who has heard his fair share of spooky tales, and as a state police officer for more than 15 years, I've landed in more weird and tense situations than you can imagine. There's always something to tell in my job, and believe me, there are moments that are worthy of any horror movie. This happened more than a decade ago, when I was still in my early days on the job. It was nighttime, and I was out patrolling an interstate highway around 3 o'clock a.m., a time when the place becomes much more eerie and even dangerous. Usually, I try to hide my patrol car a bit behind bushes so that passing cars don't see me in their path. But that night, truth be told, I wasn't too worried about that. That place was a gas station that was closed, not because it was so late, but because it had been out of service due to a technical issue for several weeks. As I parked my car, I noticed that there were two vehicles parked in the parking lot, side by side. At first, I didn't think that was unusual, but that's nightlife. Things can get strange at any time. So, even though there was nothing obvious, I kept watching. I parked in such a way that I could see the road and, at the same time, those two cars. Then, I began to notice that there was no movement in them, as if there was absolutely no one inside either vehicle, which began to set off my alarms. I thought, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. The gas station is empty, and there's not a soul working there. I got out of the car and approached the cars, tapping on the windows waiting for someone to come out. But what a surprise. There was no one in any of them, just as I had suspected. I don't know why, but I immediately felt uneasy and decided to take a look. As cars sped by on the highway, I approached the glass of the closed gas station and called out to see if anyone answered, but nothing. At that point, I spun on my heels and rested my eyes back on the cars in the parking lot, a little dazed. Whose vehicles were they, and why had they been left there? I started to think that maybe the owners were somewhere in the woods, when suddenly I heard someone running around the building yelling for help. I saw him coming towards where I was and realized it was a guy in his early 20s, like me at the time. He told me he was the owner of the car on the left and that his car wouldn't start, that he was looking for help but couldn't find anyone in the building. He then asked me to help him, to which I politely replied that I wasn't a mechanic and would most likely have to call a tow truck, but the guy kept begging me to just look under the hood for a second. I finally agreed, so he walked around to the driver's side, popped the hood, and I peeked under. The truth is, I didn't even know what to look for because I've never been a car expert. I asked him if the battery had died, but he looked at me and said he didn't think so. Something in his attitude didn't fit me. His look was strange, as if he was distracted looking for something. At that point, I already had a sense that something was wrong, and I began to feel that this night was going down a bad path. I became alert and directed all my attention towards him. Then I noticed that the guy was looking around in a very strange way, almost nervously. That's when I asked him if he was sure that his car had no problems before he got there, and he just answered, "I don't think so," while he kept looking around. At that point, I looked at the car parked next to him and asked him whose car it was. "I have no idea," he told me. "I just decided to stop here to see if I could find a bathroom." By that time, his demeanor already gave me a bad feeling, but his response finished convincing me that something was definitely not right here. At first, he told me he had stopped to get help for his car's malfunction. Then he told me the car had no malfunctions, and now he was coming out with that he was just looking for a porta potty. It was clear that something didn't add up. That's when I noticed something else. The guy suddenly looked away, and I realized he was looking at someone, or something, behind me. I turned to see what was going on, and just at that instant, another guy appears approaching with a knife in his hand. My instinct kicked in quickly. I immediately pulled out my gun and pointed it at him. The guy, scared, dropped the knife and raised his hands, just like guy number one. It was a relief, but I knew I had to act fast. I called for backup while holding the two at gunpoint. First, I cuffed the one with the knife and put him in the back of the squad car, and then I pulled another pair of shackles out of my glove box and cuffed the other guy as well, making it clear that I wasn't going to let them get away. As soon as backup arrived, I decided to go to the back of the gas station, where the first guy had originally approached, and what I found there was one of the most terrifying images I've ever seen in my entire career. There were two fresh bodies wrapped in garbage bags, and worst of all, they were cut into pieces to fit the damn bags. Next to them, there was a shovel resting on the ground, right at the edge of the woods. It was obvious that they were planning to dispose of those bodies somewhere in the woods by the side of the road, and you could tell they were in a hurry. Those two guys were probably the most idiotic criminals I had ever had to deal with. In the middle of the state, they decided to bury two bodies behind a gas station on an interstate highway. After that incident, I finished my rounds and went home with my head full of dark thoughts, knowing that I could have been in a fatal situation. That night, fear and adrenaline took over, and I couldn't sleep a wink for several days. This experience stuck with me, reminding me that, in my line of work, you never know what the next turn will bring. I was driving home from the sheriff's office that day, happy that the night was finally coming to an end. I was barely a couple of miles from home when 911 dispatch called me. "Hello, are you Officer Jake? We have a report of a fire at 22 Close Street, near the Alchemy restaurant. Firefighters are already on their way." After receiving the call, I didn't hesitate for a second, turned the car around and sped toward the location I was directed to. The 911 operator was guiding me as I drove. After making the last turn, I reached the street and immediately knew I'd arrived at the scene, as the first thing I saw was a vehicle on fire, parked on the sidewalk right in front of the restaurant, which had also been hit by the fire. I quickly stopped and got out of the patrol car with my weapon ready to fire if necessary. The vehicle burning in front of the restaurant was a large pickup truck that was completely engulfed in flames, which was strange because there was no sign of an accident. Although we had not yet checked the area enough to be sure it was not an accident, my instinct was telling me that this was something someone had done on purpose. At that instant, I heard a woman yell from the self-service area, so I immediately alerted the department. "I need backup at 22 Close Street. The street is closed. We need to get in now." The operator responded, "Backup is on the way. They'll be here in 5 minutes." But just as I was about to calm down, I heard another scream. Damn it! There was a person in trouble, but I wasn't sure where exactly the scream was coming from. "I'm coming in," I warned the operator. "No, do not go in. Repeat, do not go in. Backup is on the way. Stand by," she told me. I disconnected the radio and gripped my gun tighter. I could hear the sound of the fire truck approaching, but there was no sign of my colleagues. At that point, I decided to disregard the order and slowly advanced into the restaurant, even though I had a bad feeling. I had to be prepared because there was a 99% chance that someone dangerous was in there. Once inside, I saw the fire crew starting to fight the fire, and the adrenaline started to rush. The restaurant was in darkness, but the light coming from the burning truck, along with the red sirens of the fire truck, illuminated the place dimly, but in a terrifying way. It was then that, in a corner, I saw a woman with a face of despair, as if she was waiting for death to overtake her. Closer to her, a couple of grandparents had crawled under a table, trying to hide. There was also a guy in a chair with a black eye and a swollen jaw. Clearly, someone had beaten him up. My eyes scanned the whole place, and I didn't see anyone else. The woman in the corner looked at me, and with trembling hands pointed toward the bathroom door without saying a word. Then I raised my gun and shouted, "I'm the police. Come out wherever you are." But the door didn't move, and not a sound came out of there. "You can't escape. We are surrounding the place. Come out right now," I said again in a louder tone. "You're worse than my wife," replied a voice from the bathroom. At that moment, the door opened and a huge man appeared who looked so scary that for a moment my skin crawled. The man took a couple of steps forward and looked at me. "Don't move," I said. "Do you have any weapons?" "Of course not. I'm a real man and I can handle myself with my bare hands." "Come on, officer. Drop that gun and face me like a man," he said while smiling in a strange way. "No, I'm not here to fight you, buddy. Don't get confused. Put your hands up, and if you bring a gun, I advise you to put it on the floor right now," I replied. "I don't need a gun to put my cheating wife and her worthless lover in their place," he retorted. "Please help us, officer," shouted the woman in the corner, who I quickly deduced was the wife the guy was talking about. "You need to be more specific, honey. Who do you mean by help us? You and me, or you and him?" the guy in the bathroom said. Tension was in the air. But then the guy, full of rage, kicked a nearby table, breaking a bunch of plates and glasses, and further increasing the nervousness of everyone in the place. "I'm not the idiot you cheat and get away with it. You came for my money, and now that I'm broke, you found someone else. Nice move, but you're not getting away with it." The woman was on the verge of having a nervous breakdown, while the guy who got beaten up looked completely dejected on the chair. "Listen, you can be as angry as you want, but you don't have the right to take the law into your own hands and attack others. You can leave your wife if she's the one who failed you. Why did you hit that guy?" I said. "You're right, officer. I made a bad decision hitting this poor bastard instead of having given this scoundrel his comeuppance," he said, nailing a look full of anger towards his wife. "There's no need to become violent. Now just sit there until I tell you to get up," I said firmly, trying to calm the situation. "You mean until your real backup arrives?" he asked, with a sly look. Suddenly, it was all clear. The guy had clearly followed his wife and her lover to this restaurant, and things got out of hand. I could imagine that the burning van outside belonged to that half-conscious guy lying on a table, and that the broken chair near him was the one he had used to hit him. And all this mess had been just because his wife was cheating on him. "Stay there," I told him. The guy sat down on a stool near the bar and told me he would be quiet, then asked me, "But tell me, officer, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Wouldn't you have shot your wife by now?" "Of course I would, I'm sure. The real victim in all this is me, not this random and that other asshole." At that point, the woman started yelling at him that he was a monster, that she didn't love him, and that the other man was much more of a man than he was. He just didn't show it with his fists. These words infuriated the guy at the bar, who was almost foaming at the mouth and twice tried to get up and lash out at her. The only reason he didn't is because I was pointing my gun at him. I told the woman to calm down and not to make things worse, while the man continued to yell insults at her. "It's going to be okay," I told the wife, but she just collapsed to the ground crying. "I should have finished you off when I had the chance," the guy told the wife. In that instant, I realized that this guy really didn't have a gun. If he had, he would have shot his wife by now. so I pulled out my handcuffs and started to approach him, never taking my eyes off him at any point, because the man looked like a caged, ferocious beast. "You're going to turn around, put your hands behind your back, and don't make any funny moves, or this is going to get ugly," I warned him. "Your stupid laws are a joke. They always fall on the innocent," he replied in frustration as I handcuffed him. The craziest thing of all is that while all this chaos was going on between this couple and the woman's unfortunate lover, there were still people in the restaurant, about 4 or 5, who I guess didn't have time to escape because of the fire and just ducked under the tables. Among them, the elderly couple I saw as I entered. Fortunately, just at that moment the backups arrived. The people in the restaurant were rescued, and in the middle of the rescue, we also found the waitress unconscious in the kitchen. Maybe the guy knocked her out because she wanted to stop him. It was amazing to think how he had terrorized everyone in the place, even though he didn't have a gun. Everyone must have been paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. When we were finally leading the man toward the patrol car, his wife was there, trembling, and he stopped in front of her and gave her such an intense look that it gave me chills. "You know, I'm getting out on parole because I didn't kill anyone, and when I do, I'm coming for you. No matter where you hide, I will find you, and I will make you pay for all of this." The guy left these words with an intensity and a firmness that even I was scared. The woman started shaking when she heard that, and I could see the sweat pouring down her face. I immediately ordered the officers to take the guy away from her, but not before warning him that I would see to it that his threat to his wife was recorded in his police report. He started screaming like crazy as they took him away. "Larissa, remember my name. I will find you, and I promise you that no one can save you from me when the day comes." Listening to the things he was saying and the state this guy was in, I realized that he really was a dangerous person. I know that infidelity is not at all justified, but God only knows what this woman would have suffered next to such a violent guy. In the end, she did have to spend a good amount of time in prison for aggravated assault, damage to private property, gender violence, and disturbing the peace. This happened to me in 2008 when I was a cop in a quiet little town in Northern California. But before I get into the details, I'll give you a little context about me. I'm a guy who loves to enjoy a good cheeseburger and a good beer. I'm a Giants fan. Since I grew up in this area and went to a high school that was only a few miles from the police station, I always thought I would end up being a carpenter like my dad, but life took me down a totally different path. I like the quiet and predictability of routine, but I also enjoy a little adrenaline every now and then. That day started out like any other. I was in the middle of my shift, patrolling the streets in my assigned patrol car. The city had its typical calm and relaxed atmosphere that made you think nothing bad could happen in such a place. The fresh air smelled of pine and freshly cut grass. This was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the biggest crime that used to happen was some bar fight or some dumb teenager graffitiing where he shouldn't be. Right after lunch, I got a call about a missing person. This really took me by surprise, since missing persons cases were rare in this area, usually meaning that a teenager had decided to take a road trip without telling anyone, or that some drunk had gone on a bender and hadn't made it home yet. But for some reason, this time it felt different. The call was from a woman named Carmen Mendez, who was Mexican by birth and a frequent customer at the local restaurant. She was in a state of panic, claiming that her husband Frank had not returned home the night before. Frank was a retired firefighter, a strong, robust fellow in his 60s, well known and liked by all. He had gone out for a walk the night before and had not returned. I reassured Carmen and promised her I would do my best. I went straight to her house after that to gather more information. When I arrived, she was quite upset. She kept fidgeting back and forth and clutching her hands. I tried to calm her down by asking her about Frank's routine and if she had mentioned anything unusual lately. She told me she loved to walk in the woods behind her house, a peaceful place with trails leading to the river. I immediately knew that was the first place I should look and set off. The forest was dense and thick, a place where you could easily get lost if you weren't careful. I walked cautiously along the trails, calling out Frank's name, hoping that he had simply fallen and needed help. But as I walked deeper, an unsettling sensation swept through the air. The forest was too quiet. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It was as if the wind had stopped and the whole forest had gone silent. After a couple of hours with no sign of Frank, I called on the radio for backup. My partner, Liam Harkin, arrived shortly after with a couple of other officers. Liam was a huge guy and always had a joke ready, so his presence in a tense situation like this was comforting. We spread out to cover more ground, but nothing. It was as if Frank had evaporated. As night fell, we had to call off the search and plan to resume at dawn. I returned home after that, but I couldn't sleep well, as my head kept spinning, replaying every single thing I did, looking for some detail that perhaps I had overlooked, and this kept me from falling asleep at all. The next day, we went back to the forest, this time with a group of canine dogs. The dogs sniffed out Frank's scent near the trail, but he was just lost when we got to the riverbank. There we found his hat and a flashlight, but there were no other clues. It didn't make sense. Frank knew those woods like his own hand. He never wandered far, and there was no sign of a fight or anything indicating violence. 5 days passed and Frank was still missing. The town was restless, everyone muttering theories and speculating. Some said he had a heart attack and fell into the river, but the divers found nothing. Others thought maybe a wild animal had attacked him, but there were no footprints or traces of blood or clothing to back that up either. Frank's disappearance was a complete mystery, and of course there were those who attributed it to an alien abduction or something out of this world. That is, it's California, and let's say that Hollywood has penetrated deep into the collective imagination. The truth is that I couldn't let it go. This was something that ate at me, so I spent all my free hours combing the woods, looking for any kind of answer. But one night, just as the sun was beginning to set, I came across something strange. A clearing deep in the forest that I had never seen before. In the middle, there was an old abandoned cabin, almost completely covered by weeds and moss growing uncontrollably. It was very strange because I had never seen this place before, and I don't think anyone else knew it existed. The cabin must have been very old, because the deterioration was noticeable. The windows were broken, and it looked like it had been uninhabited for a long time. I approached cautiously, with my hand on my gun. I opened the door, which creaked noisily in the silence. The air inside was musty and damp, while a few motes danced in the light streaming through the windows. I found a bed made of straw, a table with old food cans, and a pile of yellowed newspapers. As I looked through them, I noticed that they were dated in the late 1980s and all spoke of missing persons. My heart was pounding as I read. Each article told the same story. Someone had disappeared in the woods and was never seen again. I snapped a few pictures with my phone and hurried back to the station, my mind racing. Of course. I showed the photos to Liam and the boss, but they failed to see the connection I had made. The boss shrugged and said it was probably just an old hermit shelter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something dark going on. A couple of nights later, I decided to return to the cabin, this time more prepared. I grabbed a flashlight, my gun, and above all, armed myself with great determination. The forest was eerily quiet as I approached the clearing and my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The cabin was just as I had left it, but now I noticed a detail that had escaped my notice. There was a trap door in the floor, partially covered by a rug, something that immediately attracted my full attention. I pushed the carpet aside and opened it, revealing a wooden staircase descending into the darkness. The air below was cold and damp. I reached down with my flashlight, and the light barely illuminated what was at the bottom. A narrow tunnel stretched out in front of me. Of course I followed it, and my footsteps echoed in the narrow tunnel. After what seemed like an eternity, the tunnel finally opened up into a much larger room, and what I saw there froze my heart. The walls were covered with photos and newspaper clippings of missing people, including Frank. In the center, there was a chair, and in it was Frank, bound and gagged, but alive. His eyes widened like saucers when he saw me, in a mixture of shock and relief. I ran to him quickly, tearing at the ropes that held him prisoner. He was weak and dehydrated, but managed to mumble, "Thank you." I helped him up, and we hurried back down the tunnel, moving as fast as he could. We got out of the cabin and I heard a noise behind us. Then I turned and saw a guy standing in the doorway, a wild look in his eyes. He was tall and scrawny, with an unkempt beard and eyes that seemed to pierce the gloom. As he got closer, his rough, menacing voice made me shiver, but I drew my gun and pointed it at him. "Get away," I warned him, keeping my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. But the man let out a chilling laugh and said, "You think you can stop me?" He shouted and lunged toward us. I fired a couple of shots, and the sound of the shot echoed through the woods, samples of the man falling to the ground, clutching his leg. I didn't wait to see if he would get up again. I just helped Frank into the car while I radioed the station, alerting them to the situation. Then we sped into town. Frank was taken to the hospital, where he made a full recovery within a few days. The guy, who identified himself as Ronald Graham, turned out to be a homeless man with a long history of mental problems. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and murder. He confessed that he had kidnapped Frank and 10 other people over the course of more than 20 years. But the most chilling thing is the reason he did it. The man would hold his victims captive in that old cabin for days before murdering them, chopping them up and consuming them as food, as if they were something to hunt. The town was shocked by the news. People began to lock their doors more carefully each night, and the woods became a place everyone feared. For me, bringing Frank back was a blessing, but everything that was discovered afterwards left me with a deep sense of unease and shock, and made me think about many things. How was it possible that this demented one could have committed such atrocities for 20 years without ever being caught? I'm still patrolling the streets and enjoying a good cheeseburger and a cold beer. However, there is a part of me that is always tense, always looking over my shoulder. The forest may have finally revealed its darkest secret, but the scars left by this macabre find are still there. A couple of years ago, I got a promotion and decided it was time to move to a new apartment. My old place was full of problems, and I knew I should have checked it out better before I moved. So, as I started looking for a new home, I became a little heavy with questions. One day, I decided to ask a realtor how thick the front door was. My best friend, Evan, would have laughed at me, saying that no landlord takes it seriously, and he was kind of right, but it was important to me. When I finally found a place I liked, the stress was unbelievable. I was competing with over 100 people for rent. The apartment had huge windows to the west, which meant spectacular sunsets and perfect for my plants, and the shower was fabulous. It had a built-in waterproof Bluetooth speaker and ultraviolet lights, so no bacteria buildup. It was really amazing, and luckily I was able to rent it. When I moved in, everything seemed to go smoothly. But just 8 days later, while I was on the couch watching TV relaxing, everything turned to chaos. A banging noise in the hallway started to make me nervous. At first I didn't think anything of it, thinking it might be someone outside, but after a while I decided to at least take a look. I walked down the hallway, and what I discovered was that the noise was coming from my bathroom. I opened the door and there it was, a leak coming from the vent in the ceiling. It had barely been a week and I already had a leak. Sure, it was small, but if you've ever dealt with this sort of thing, you know that any water leak can turn into a disaster, so I went into panic mode, looking for plumbers and muttering curses at the landlady for not telling me there were problems with the pipes. The rain that was falling didn't help. Sure, there might be something to do with that, but I had a third floor above me, so it was unlikely. After a while, I realized it was probably coming from upstairs. Maybe they left the bathtub running or something. I ran upstairs and knocked on the door of the apartment right above mine, but no one answered. I made sure no one was looking and knelt down to put my ear to the lock. Try explaining that to a stranger with no context. I expected to hear water running or someone cleaning up the mess in the tub, but there was only silence. I restrained myself from kicking the door and returned to my spot, putting a bucket on the leak that was dripping. I then called my landlady in case she had a plumber on the hook, and fortunately he helped me. Luckily, the leak was manageable for now, but we still had to get into the upstairs to see if it was really from there. So I would go upstairs every now and then to see if anyone was home. I assumed people were out because they didn't respond, but I still went back to look once, twice, even 3 times. The last time I tried it was just before 8 o'clock at night, and the plumber would arrive in 10 minutes. Fortunately, this time the door was ajar. I thought I'd be nice, so I knocked a couple of times and shouted a "Hello," hoping someone would answer. But again, nothing sounded but the dripping of water inside the place. After several unanswered knocks, I decided to open the door, revealing the completely soaked carpet. As I moved forward, I knew the first place I would find was the bathroom, and there it was. The floor flooded, the sink dripping, but the faucets were open, as if someone had forgotten to turn them off. I felt a knot in my stomach as I realized that something was not right. It was impossible for someone to be there without noticing the disaster. I moved forward cautiously, feeling a little weird about barging in like this, but the silence was getting heavy. As I got closer to the room, the feeling that something was very wrong grew. And when I saw her, I knew immediately that my fears were real. There she was, on the floor, lying face down with her eyes half open and her skin grayish. I had never seen someone like that before. Panic set in immediately. I didn't need to take her pulse to know it was bad. I tried to call her and get her to wake up, but no, it was too late. She was gone. I called 911 with my heart pounding in my chest and feeling very panicky. It was really traumatic. There I was, treading water on the floor, tirelessly resuscitating a corpse, begging her to wake up. But finally, after a while, I sat on the floor and accepted the inevitable. She was dead, and there was nothing more I could do. I had never cried like that for a stranger before. I didn't care to admit it, so I just sat there until I saw blue lights flashing outside. The police arrived and entered the apartment, searching everything while telling me it was okay and that I had done the right thing. We went down to my apartment where I sat down with tea and told them what happened. I talked about how the door seemed to open on its own, which meant that between 1935 and 1957, the girl or her killer had entered. I saw two officers exchange glances, and while I thought it was a wow moment, I eventually realized it was more like complicity. At first, they treated me like I was some poor guy who had found a crime scene, but soon things changed course. One of the policemen, who called himself Fight, invited me back to the station for a couple more questions. He assured me I wasn't in trouble. They just needed to clear up some details because of some new evidence that had come out. It seemed like a casual chat, so without giving it much thought, I agreed and went to talk to them in a room with no one else. At first, they were super nice, going over what I had said and criticizing me for trying to do resuscitation, but everything suddenly changed when one of the detectives asked me if I had been to the girl's apartment earlier that night. I told them I'd barely been here a week, that I wasn't the type to greet the neighbors with pies or anything. Then, they asked if I knew anything about electricity, as if I had ever worked in that. I told them no, and it was my turn to ask them why such a weird question. That's when they blurted out that I was their prime suspect. The officer said it in such an unsubtle way that it made me uncomfortable. "Look, buddy, we're in a bit of a jam and we think you can give us a hand." They started acting like we were lifelong friends, thanking me for all the details I had shared. But there was one big problem. I mentioned that I had knocked on the door 3 times between 8 and 9 p.m., right when the death occurred, and they thought it was at 8:45 p.m. They asked me why I hadn't heard it. They asked me why I hadn't heard anything when I knocked the second time, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I understood that this was all very strange and confusing. I remembered every word of what they said, although they didn't seem to want to accuse me. I don't think they were saying it directly, but I knew they were trying to see me as a suspect. Unfortunately, it was easier to deduce it that way because my fingerprints were all over the place. My clothes had fibers on them, and there wasn't a single witness who could say that someone else had been in that girl's apartment. Just me. Eventually, it became obvious that the police had me in their sights, although I was never arrested. In the weeks that followed, my apartment was searched twice, and the police were always hanging around the building. I noticed that they seemed very interested in the wiring, and sometimes brought in electricians. That's when it dawned on me that they thought the girl had died from an electrical accident. Maybe the current had run through the water and electrocuted her. But if that was true, then I would be dead too, wouldn't I? Although the police never gave me many details about the investigation, I was pretty sure they believed I had something to do with the girl's death. Don't get me wrong, being considered the prime suspect is scary, but at the same time, I was never arrested, and after a while, everything seemed to calm down. Sure, I wanted to know more about what they knew about my neighbor's death, but after being practically accused of murder, I didn't feel much like drawing more attention to myself. It was obvious that I was in the middle of a murder and had no idea what was going on. Why did they leave the door open on the way out? They couldn't have believed I wouldn't notice. And the flooding, what was the reason behind that? Not only was the bathroom sink overflowing, but so was the kitchen. The electrocution issue seems so complicated to me in this case. Why do all that? How would someone have the ability to flood a place and then run current to electrocute someone? That would take some planning, and the person doing it would have to be somewhere else so they wouldn't get electrocuted too. It left me wondering, who really opened the door? Was it all a plan to take her life and have someone find her? Too many questions. I spent so much time staring at the ceiling that I couldn't seem to escape all the doubts that had arisen since I moved in. It's a nice place, but now it's polluted, and I don't have the money to move somewhere else. Finding something I really like is complicated, and that's what haunts me. I've been living in what feels like a tomb, and the mysteries of my neighbor's death have kept me up for nights on end. I'd love to hear other people's theories about what happened, because, like the cops, I'm totally lost. Maybe it's something completely trivial but tragic. although sometimes my mind flies and I start to imagine that there's something much more sinister behind it all. I don't know why, but I have the feeling that she actually planned her death that way herself. It's just a hunch, but I have no idea really how exactly or with what intention.